Good morning to everyone. This is Farki AS from Sri Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj College of Engineering. The topic which I am going to discuss today is exception handling. Now, what is exception? It is a problem which arises during an execution. That problem is nothing but it may be a part of an error. It may be a type of error which is being defined while execution. It may be also a problem which is related to the library set of your language in the Java. It may be a problem which is related to the location of execution, which we define from the command prompt. So now, when this exception is going to occur is sometimes we define a type of object by a name, say something a animal, and by defining an animal, you define it animals in the henceforth code. It gives you an error because how we are going to identify an object by its class and by its functionality. So second part here is what if you put a invalid data. Now invalid data is a type of a data which is irrelevant data, which is not in which we are not in focus with to write in your code, but then also we show it that how can we write the data and then how we put a data into an invalidations, or somewhat we define it in terms of multiple declarations, and sometimes this multiple declarations can also be proved as an invalid data. In terms of invalid, the invalidity of my data may is being checked with respect to the definitions what I am defining here. Sometimes the invalid data is being checked with respect to multiple declaration syntax errors. Sometimes it is defined by a L value set, and sometimes it is also defined by the system and the compiler which is used to execute it. Secondly, this exception is introduced when you are searching a file, when you need to search a file and then you need to access a file, but in some cases it doesn't happen, it doesn't gives you the searched file and it doesn't gives you an access. So again we say that the exception is occurred, exceptions are being occurred. So it is again a part of an error here. Some of the times we say that a network connection has been lost in the middle communications, or the Java virtual machine has run out of the memories. Now what happens here, sometimes when we see that when we are fixing a set of codes or set of errors on online interactions, at that time what happens, if your internet or if any connection error is there, or if your Java virtual machine runs out of an memory, at that time it gives you an error again that there is an exceptions here. Some exceptions are caused by a user error. Yeah, it is fine, because why it is so, sometimes we define something and afterwards we declare something which is non-usual. Like say for example, if I'm writing a employee but I'm writing a employee, and in terms of employee I'm declaring empy, so it gives me an error even though the definition may be the same but the declaration values are not same. No, so it is again going to give me a error here. Now coming to the part of the categories. Categories of exceptions are what? Check the exceptions. A checked exception is nothing but an exception that is typically a user error or a problem that can be foreseen by a programmer. Now here what happens is, if you are tracing an exceptions here, if you are trying to trace an error here, we say that it is a checked exceptions, because sometimes when we define a multiple declaration value with some or the other different declared symptoms, at that time we say that a checked exceptions can be occurred, because you can modify it again, you can create it, because checked exceptions are being identified when you're writing an instruction set or a code. Secondly, checked exceptions also deals with the editing of the part of the program, which is more concerned about the data which you are defining or at the time of declarations in the code syntaxes. Runtime exception. Runtime exception is nothing but that occurs due to a probably has been avoided by a programmer. But runtime is what, when you define it, when two different keywords are defined for one single functionality, at the time of execution your compiler gives you an error specifying that there was an exception which is being declared at the time of executing that specific programs or that specific set of instructions. We can overcome it at a runtime also, but again you have to modify it by considering multiple declarations into a single set of declaration syntaxes. Errors, these are not the exceptions but problems that arise beyond the control of the user or a programmer. Errors are typically ignored in your code because you can rarely do it anything about an error. For example, if a stack overflow occurs, an error will arise. They are also ignored at the time of compilations. Now what your error here is, it is keen interested about your execution, but your execution is nothing but how it is going to work. Now, exception hierarchy. All exception classes are the subtypes of a Java language. Exception classes. The exception classes is a subclass of a throwable classes. Other than the exception class, there is another subclass called error, which is derived from the throwable classes. Now, usually, throw is what if you're putting a somewhat of if you're putting a adjustment or if you're overriding some set of code onto the code which has been shown you an error previously, you can show that we can throw an exceptions there. We can throw it on we throw on the exceptions, and in that way we can handle the exceptions also. So secondly, errors are not a normal. Okay, yeah, it is trapped from the Java programs. These conditions normally happen in case of severe failures which are not handled by the Java program. Errors are generated to indicate the error generated by the runtime environment. So it depends again on the platform which you are using at the time of executions. For example, Java virtual machine is out of memory. Normally a program cannot recover from the errors, but again the exceptions has two main subclasses, input exceptions and the runtime exception classes. So this is a diagram which I came across. If there is an input exception, there is a runtime exception. These both are the subtypes of the exceptions. These exceptions may be a part of an exception also, or that may be a part of an error also. But these both are again being is a throwable part of the throwable part in your code. Now, what actually the throwable part is in the code is whether now if I do it in terms of reverse engineering, I need to throw what I need to throw, whether and I need to modify an error and then I need to fix on it, or whether I need to throw an exceptions on it. Okay, if I'm putting an exceptions here, whether I'm putting an input exceptions or I'm giving it as a runtime exceptions here. So it deals with a reverse engineering, but is more concerned about the type of code which we execute at the execution of your Java programs here. A catching exception. It is a method. An exception is using a combination of try and catch keywords. A try or a catch is a block is placed around the code that might generate an exception. Code within a try or a catch block is referred as a protected code, and the syntax for using it. Now specifically a code is being put up here. A try is again you are re-executing it again. A protected code is being provided here. After that you are catching it, or you are just catching means what, you are keeping a keyword with it and then you are reading the keywords. You are calling a keyword from through an exceptions here. And a cache is nothing but it is going to show you the declaration type of exceptions which you are trying to catch it. For example, I may say that when I need to catch the exceptions, I may say that I am more focusedly or more highlighting that specific exceptions which deals with the working function or the working scenarios of that specific functionalities. Throw and throws. Now usually throw and throws are both the one and the same thing, but throw is a singular and throws is plural. If a method doesn't handle a checked exception, the method must be declared by using a throw keyword. Now usually this throw keyword is what you are just modifying it within the same set of program, assuming that the same set of functionality can be remodified and can be used during the executional pattern at the time of executing that code within it. And the throw keyword appears at the end of method because it is going to give me an output which I have to define it here. You can throw an exception, either a newly initiated one over the exception that you just caught by using a throw keyword. So, and the final keyword. Now, a keyword is nothing but is used to create a block of a code that follows a try block. Finally, a block of a code always executes whether or not exceptions has occurred. And using a final as a block allows you to run a cleanup type of statements that you want to execute no matter whatever happens in the protected class. Now, usually finally is what? First of all, you have to conclude it. When you are concluding it, conclusion means what? If you are executing it in terms of final as a keyword, a final as a keyword is going to work in terms of an output generated method. Here you are generating an output. After generating an output, you are specifically saying that this is the final function of that specific code. Now, usually when we define a final as a keyword here, whenever we write a set of instructions here, we write a set of instructions by defining it in terms of keyword, in terms of input, in terms of an classes, in terms of object, in terms of method, in terms of polymorphism sentences, in terms of inheritance, in terms of exceptions. Now here the exceptions again is finding an error here, but when we are using it or whenever we are executing it in terms of executing that specific code here, what we actually do is we just go for a final and we say that what would be the conclusion of that specific individual code or set of instructions, because when set of instructions is being executed here, the set of instruction is being converted, and then this set of instruction is again going to give you an idea about how that specific code can be created and that code can be concluded here. So in this way we have concluded. Now there is a syntax here. Syntax is what? Again, I am putting a try. I'm in a protected mode. I'm writing a code here. After creating a protected mode, catch is nothing but it is going to highlight a one specific set of instructions set from which you are going to execute it. Now here a specific set of instructions, it can be a class, it can be a method, but more specifically if I say that it is a class, because a class is going to give me an information about what sort of functionalities that specific object is going to have within it. When I'm going for an exception, now again here I am having a catch with exception type 1 and exception type 2 and a catch with exceptions type 3. These types of a program is nothing but a multitasking programs with a single using classes methods here. So when we speak about a mutual exclusion, or when we speak about the mutual execution of same classes but is going to have a different functionality, at that time we go for a try and catch method, because when a functionalities are more than one functions defined into your code, your catch is going to give you an idea about which specific functions can be selected, and with respect to that specific function, how that specific function can be executed, making a reminder of two other functions. That is what I'm telling is, even if the three different functions are defined, here he is going to execute only one, and while the two functionality is going to become an ideal functionality is here. And with respect to it, if you're after one specific execution, you are going to execute it the second time, the functionality will be different, and at the third time you are going to execute the other as a third functionality here. So with respect to these three functionalities, here we are going to say that the specific functionality or the specific functions which I have defined here is being executed separately, individually, and then after executing all the functionalities, then we are going to finally is going to conclude that that specific functionality having a n number of multiple classes or having a n number of multiple objects is being executed, assuming that in a one single program a multiple functionalities has been executed here. And finally is nothing but is going to give me a sentence that okay, that particular execution of a specific program is being terminated now. Now other exceptions. What are actually the other exceptions? Exceptions is nothing but there are two possibilities now. JVM exceptions. Now JVM is nothing but Java virtual machines. What happens here, that these are exceptions or error that exclusively or logically is being thrown by a JVM. Now there may be like an example we have provided here. It may be a null pointer exception, it may be an array indexing out of bound exception, or it may be a class cast exception. Now actually what happens in a pointer, sometimes this sort of error is being defined or is being introduced when a pointer is being defined. We sometimes deals with a multi-pointer taskings here. Sometimes when we define a multitasking pointers here, these multitasking pointers may create an error, because it depends that how you are defining a pointer with respect to a different functionalities. and how you are mapping a pointers within a Java here. So when we speak with respect to pointers here, when you are introducing a pointer, there are a single pointers are also there and a multi pointers are also there. Usually in a single pointer we never have errors here. Usually because in a single pointer we can map us pointers with respect to its functionalities. But when we speak about a multi pointers here, multi pointers is nothing but is a specification of executing one pointer within the pointer and getting an output for a third pointer. At that time, in a multi pointer specification, we feel and that there might be an error in the JVMs, because more precisely when we have to map it, we are unable to map the specific pointer by its functionality and the specific pointer by its class of execution also. So that is why we say that there may be a problems of the null pointers, null pointers also. Secondly, array indexing is what? Sometimes we define an array in terms of we have to define an array, but when we define an array, we go for the storage of data with respect to indexing pattern. But sometimes what happens here, in and out of bound, when we put an array, when we store a data with respect to 2Ds, 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional, at that time the specification of the data storage may be failed with respect to the type of array which you're using while storing that specific data. And programmatic exceptions. Programmatic exceptions are nothing but these exceptions are thrown explicitly by the application or the API programmers. For example, illegal argument exceptions and legal state exceptions. So these were the types which we have defined, which I have specifically said to you with respect to exceptions. Sometimes the need of exceptions here is because why the exception gets occur. There are many causes of getting an exception to get occurred while executing, because sometimes when we speak about an exception, we may define a class but object is not clear. When we define an object, we are unable to define a method. When we are defining a method, we are unable to define its executional pattern. So sometimes when we are unable to define an object with its multiple functionality or with its multiple identified functionality, at that time we has to face an exceptions within it. And exceptions sometimes we also say in some languages, not in Java only but in other languages also, we sometimes say that even if some languages are sensitive languages, the sensitivity of that specific languages is also being handled by the exceptions also in that specific languages. So this is how we have came over the exceptions part. There are again many different tasks of exceptions too. So till then, thank you. This was the end of the part of exceptions handling and exceptions in the Java language. Thank you.